Hi, so you guys like history? I really hope you do. If not, I'm gonna come to your house tonight and draw really bad images of my adorable face all over yours. I mean, I'll just tell you anyways, because why the hell not, right? Well, I happen to love history. It's one of those things that every time I turn around, I can't help but stop and ask myself, what are people going to remember us by? Because if we take away all the Instagram posts and TikToks, we're left with a candidly vague image of what our modern history might look like. It really makes you stop and think what day-to-day life was really like for people in the not-so-distant past, let alone those who existed centuries ago. It really is exciting when you hear about someone's hometown hero or someone just outright obscure who blows up in popularity because of what they've done. So the guy I want to talk about today is an absolute bad Larry by the name of John Stark, a big bald unit of a general who served in both the French and Indian War as part of a specialized unit, as well as during the American Revolution, where he absolutely slapped cheeks and made the enemy general surrender. From a ranger of the colonies to the hero who stepped out of retirement to meet an invading force, it's easy to overlook the fact that this guy actually existed and isn't some Warhammer 40k character. Born in the state of New Hampshire in August of 1728, the absolute legend himself made his appearance in the town of Londonderry, moving at the age of 8 years old to Manchester, where he would live a normal life until the 1750s. This is when he would be captured by a Native American tribe known as the Abenaki during a hunting and trapping expedition near the Baker's River. Having been a colonist all of his life, John was quite the capable woodsman, and his bravery and skill easily impressed the chief of the tribe, who he was captured by. The reason why this impressed the chief so much was due to the fact that the man as well as his comrade Amos were able to survive running through a gauntlet of stick-wielding warriors who attempted to beat them to death. Soon he as well as Amos were made official tribe members, where he was taught some of their ways before he would eventually be freed when his ransom was paid the following year. Following this, he would marry a woman, Elizabeth, before eventually having 11 children with her, proving he was more than just a legend on the battlefield. It was during these years that he would come to see John perfecting his skills in hunting, trapping, and outdoorsmanship, as it was required for the survival of the colonies at the time, not being a place for the soft underbellies, especially in the rough wilderness that was New Hampshire. It was during the French and Indian War that John would come to know his first encounters with war, as he was attached to a unit known as the Rogers Rangers, fierce men who utilized their skills and hunting prowess to overwhelm enemies on the battlefield. It was with these men that he was pressed deep into Abenaki territory, where out of respect for his parents, who lived amongst the tribe, refused to aid in the attack against them. During his time with the Rangers, he gained valuable insight on the northern frontier and served in many military operations up until the end of the war, where he returned back to Derryfield as an officially retired. I wish there was more known about this man's adventures on the northern frontier, but I could not seem to pull up more on his exploits in the French and Indian War. However, that's okay, seeing there's a lot to do with the Revolutionary War coming up. So what's a man to do? He's been retired as a captain in one of the best militias in the colonies. He's fought an entire war and made peace with his demons, and he's got 11 children who won't stop asking if he's killed someone or not. I can imagine that's got to be a lot on a guy who's got a bunch of people in Boston that started getting wacky and throwing tea in the river, and you can be willing to bet he was one of the first people to read it in the newspaper, taking a long-winded drag from his old-timey pipe and giving it a good old pre-Vietnam nom flashback, and like any good Alice in Chains rooster moments, at the breakout of the war would occur on April 19, 1775. John Stark would recommission himself formally on April 23rd. That's right, it took this retired man 4 days to start reeing ecstatically and loading his musket hyperactively, looking for prestige in Call of Duty Revolutionary War Edition. Now, at first it wasn't all eating cake and slapping cheeks for the old man, as he accepted the position of colonel in the New Hampshire militia, being given the 1st New Hampshire Regiment as well as the 3rd, because apparently having the 1st and 2nd Regiments under one command would be too demoralizing or too ordinary for the Revolutionary War era colonists to accept. Now, as soon as this man had consolidated his forces, the moment he had even a semblance of his full strength, he would immediately ship himself and both regiments into the blockaded Boston to assist the rebels in some Clone Wars level Jedi nonsense. While the Battle of Bunker Hill was taking place, raging on and pissing fire on both directions, both metaphorically and rhythmatically, yes, I'm looking at you, drummer boys, the New Hampshire regiments would just kind of show up when reinforcements were requested. William Prescott knew he couldn't hold the hill on his own, as he wanted as many regiments as possible, ones who were usually at this point broken up or at reduced strength due to the ongoing fighting. But in comes John Stark and his big stick of 2 regiments. It was then that he showed his bravery, and amongst the disorder of men inhaling artillery fire from the HMS Lively, he would order the companies to stand aside and proudly marching his 2 New Hampshire regiments firmly towards Prescott's position, fortifying them with no casualties and changing the balance of the battle itself temporarily. Once Stark had fortified the position, Prescott allowed him to deploy his men wherever he saw fit, choosing to fortify the Mystic River in fear of a flanking maneuver by the British. It was here that his regiments were able to form a firing line which not only repelled the perceived flanking maneuver by the British, but also proved to be the front for the influx of British infantry which were now against the 2 New Hampshire regiments, as they were able to counter something that would end quickly with an American victory, widely in part of Stark's insights on the battlefield as it was occurring. Finally, after a 3rd failed attempt by the British to land in Mystic River, they would find themselves retreating, in search of an alternate zone for their offensives, leaving the ball firmly in John's court. Though soon after the Americans would be forced from the hill, it was John Stark's men who laid down cover fire for Prescott, making the British bleed for every inch of ground that they took for the 2 weeks it took for George Washington to arrive in order to liberate Boston. After his time in the Battle of Bunker Hill, his name had passed into the ears of George Washington, who needed people to command his troops with the same effectiveness that John Stark had displayed. Because of this, John and his New Hampshire regiments would connect themselves to the Continental Army and take part in the invasion of Canada. He fought with distinction during the battles of Princeton and Trenton until he, along with the rest of the Continental Army, was eventually beaten out of the region. After the Battle of Trenton, he would be asked to return home to New Hampshire to replenish the strength of his regiment numbers as well as for the Continental Army, where he learned about the fact that he had been overturned by a man he saw as unworthy of the title of the rank of general. After this, he would give the Continental Army the middle finger and vowed only to protect his home colony. To be stark on the situation, Washington did pass up the highly decorated folk hero of a man for some guy who wouldn't even march his troops to assist Boston, only for the rank of Brigadier General. One can only imagine that when he got home, he probably had a couple more talking children, as well as several more of them asking how many times he had seen a guy with a musket ball in them, because it only took 4 months for him to be tempted back into some form of military service to his country, because you can't keep a good hero down for too long. The New Hampshire militia would formally request John Stark to come back into their ranks at the privilege of being promoted to Brigadier General, the rank which Washington had passed him up for in the first place. More than happy to accept it, presumably both because he missed the smell of musket fire as well as hated civilian life to begin with, he'd packed himself and about 1,500 men up in civilian clothing with their own personal firearms, vowing that if he served the militia he would hold no ties to the Continental Army, serving instead as a form of mercenary if one chooses to think about it, just instead of for money working for the betterment of his colony, making his way straight to Manchester, Vermont with all 1,500 of his troops. When Stark and his men arrived in Manchester, he immediately got in a disagreement with the acting general of the area, whom he saw himself as better than, and who was unfairly promoted over himself, eventually being told he could operate freely against the opposing general, a man by the name of John Burgoyne. He would hear of an oncoming raid from British forces on the town of Bennington, Vermont, a vital supply hub for the Continental Army, which if captured would prove to be a powerful blow to their initiative. The commanding officer for the British chose to try and attack the position, which held only 1,800 men with his combined force of 650 men, with 2 cannons, seeking to wait for reinforcement by an additional 600 men with 2 6-pound cannons to make their way to his encampment. After a day of waiting, all they would find would be the envelopment strategy of on all sides at first to soften up the British forces, creating disarray and panic as many retreated in the face of a blatant charge of 1,200 men spearheaded by John Stark himself. He was quoted stating that if he did not win the battle, his wife would be a widow, presuming to be willing to fight to the very last man that day. With their forces scattered, the dragoons under the British command attempted to fight their way out of the entrapment with swords in hand, only to succumb in time for its reinforcements to arrive. As the British reinforcements made their way into the area, so did that of 350 Vermont troops known as the Mountain Boys, headed by Seth Warner, who promptly, with the help of the New Hampshire regiments, savaged the British and Hessian troops, leading to a third of them being decimated that day. The actions of Stark had contributed to directly caused to the surrender of John Burgoyne to the Continental Army at the Battle of Saratoga, delivering a serious blow to the British military effort at the time, and sapping them of hundreds of men who were forced to retreat or were captured. For this reason, he was formally given the title of Major General in the Continental Army, given to him presumably as a big dick energy way of flipping off those other incompetent generals at the time. The battle overall proved to be one of the major turning points of the Revolutionary War, where only a few hundred on one side of a conflict were able to cause insurmountable damage to the enemy through nothing but bravery and an understanding of their own limitations. After the Battle of Bennington, he served with distinction as a judge during the court hearings of Benedict Arnold as well as John Andre, and served as the department commander for the North 3 times before finally retiring once more after his last notable battle at Springfield in 1780. Formally retiring in the year of 1810, John Stark lived an extraordinary life, dying at the age of 93 in 1822. He was a man who lived his life to the fullest and championed a phrase so powerful that the state I was born in uses it as their official slogan to this day. Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils, or as we know it, live free or die. It's a phrase I grew up with. My mother lived by it, and my grandmother certainly used it a lot. It's on license plates and on keychains, hell, some people even tattoo it on their body. But it's a phrase that to me means something much more weighted than most are willing to interpret. The words were said during a major battle when he was either going to win for the freedom of his country or die as another casualty to the British Empire. He was what in many ways all humans are. People who are capable of greatness when we throw away the fear of death for the knowledge that we might gain the greater freedom. We see it all the time in the media, comics, and fairy tales. It's in statements like fortune favors the brave. It is striving to reach something better rather than grapple into the dirt as we are. Mr. Stark, thank you for inspiring our generation near silently with words that ring so true. Rest well, and thank you all for watching.